next speaker, another independent researcher and investigator for many years in the Kennedy case, and especially into events in New Orleans. He intersected with his own life and his family, and a lot of us start there. My mother worked for 30 years as the highest paid woman of the Pentagon. She was 5 levels above top security. She had access to the war room. We moved into the bedroom community, the NSA, the NRO, the DIA, the CIA. I knew there were 2 governments operating from quite young. I've often said in my lectures that if we all would just tell our own family histories, the whole game would fall apart. But our next speaker, Ed Haslam, is here. He did an early version of his book, Mary Ferrie and the Monkey Virus, and now Dr. Mary's Monkey is an update on that, and he's got some fascinating stuff to tell about Oswald and New Orleans and Dr. Oxner and the people around him.
Do I need to be at the microphone?
Yeah. You want to sit? Or
Well, my problem is I need to be in front of the computer to
all right,
operate
we'll
the...
take this down and then put it next to your mouth over there. It won't be in the way.
And I can't be standing
Yeah,
here.
just go to the left side, probably better.
You can sit there.
Okay.
Yeah. Get this over near you. That work?
Yeah, there's no point in seeing my talking head. The important thing is on the screen. And so I've got a lot of material here for 20 minutes. So I'm going to get rolling, and this is my book, of course, and it would help if you plugged in the mouse. Tech support! I last spoke at COPA in '94 and '95. I forget the year. It was in Washington, D.C. I do remember that part. And I hadn't even finished figuring out what burned off Mary Sherman's arm at the time. So I still hadn't gotten to sort of the end of my investigation. And in 1995, I came out with my first book, Mary Ferrie and the Monkey Virus, which put me way out on a scientific limb at the time. And but I hadn't located the linear particle accelerator that burned off Mary's arm. In 1996 I did that, so in 1997 I updated my book and expanded it, and I wrote a new chapter called The Machine. In 2000 I was contacted by 60 Minutes because they had found a woman who said that she had participated in the underground medical laboratory that I wrote about in my first book. And after a lot of to-do, I wrote several new chapters on the book, 2 of them on Judith Ferrie Baker and 1 on Lee Harvey Oswald. And in 2007 that was published as Dr. Mary's Monkey. So the first book is kind of inside the second book, plus it's got about 4 extra chapters in there. Then in a completely different set of events, Trine Day wound up with a manuscript on Judith Ferrie Baker's autobiography. And they asked me to do the first round editing on it. Basically, I had to cut out about 200 pages. And so I have spent most of the last year, most of 2009, working on the raw manuscript of Judith Ferrie Baker's autobiography about her relationship with Lee Harvey Oswald, which will be published the beginning of next year. And that's what I want to brief you on instead of just talking about my book. When we get to the end of the speech, I'll tell you about my website because they've got 2-hour interviews with me on the website. So if you want to hear me talk about the book, you can go hear it then, but you can't hear what I'm about to say to you right now anywhere else. So I'm going to take advantage of this time to do it that way. Get this working, yeah. Okay, by the time I started editing, I had known Judith Ferrie Baker for 8 years. I had spent 100+ hours with her on the telephone. I had exchanged over 1,000 emails with her. I had read her 700-page book. I had spent 4 days with her in person. I had watched all of her videos. I wrote 2 chapters about her in my book, and I personally managed the content of her website. Okay? Therefore, I thought I knew her story fairly well as I approached her manuscript. And what I found out was that I knew the 66-year-old woman named Judith Very Baker that we have today, who was trying to tell a very complicated story about something very painful that happened a long time ago. And what I hadn't gotten to yet was understanding Judy. This is a beautiful young girl who lived a unique and extraordinary life long before she met Lee Harvey Oswald. And her story, in my opinion, is actually far better than anything anybody has ever heard about her. Okay? And the more I got into it, the more, I understood her story because I started to see how the pieces fit together, but also I got to see the relevance of it at a new level. And I think that's what you can look forward to in this book. When you look at the who's, the whens, the whys, it just ties together. Here is a story about a little girl who at the age of 5 almost dies. Okay, she spends a year and a half in the hospital, and the nuns come and pray at her bedside. When she finally recovers, they tell her God saved her, and that God has a purpose for her. Well, at the age of 13, Judy finds her purpose. She watches her grandmother die from cancer, and she decides she's going to be the person who finds the cure for cancer. That's now the goal of her life. And so she starts her own cancer experiments at the age of 13. Well, the local chapter of the American Cancer Society finds out about this, and they decide to help her. Okay? On August 3rd, 1958, they take Judy to Lakeland, Florida for the opening of the Watson Clinic. Here we see the founder, Dr. Watson, shaking hands with his good friend, Dr. Alton Oshner, who delivers the keynote speech on the death of a smoker. Judy gets to meet Oshner at the reception, and his speech inspires her to do her own experiments on the connections between cigarette smoking and lung cancer.
She's age 15, right?
She's 15 at this point. In 1960, she starts winning science competitions, really major ones. Okay? She gets publicity. She gets laboratory equipment from the community. She gets laboratory quality mice from the professionals in the country that do laboratory quality mice. She gets help from doctors, serious doctors, okay? She gets access to radiation equipment. She gets medical quality microscopes, and she gets help from the military. Beep, beep, beep. Is your BS meter going off yet? Okay? I would like you to show me the proof of this, Ed. Okay. Here is the letter from Walter Reed, Army Institute of Research, all right? And it is addressed to Judith Very, September 1960. And if you will ask me about this during the question and answer session, I will answer the rest of the questions you have about this, like what and why and how and all that stuff. Moving on with the story, Judy's cancer experiments get press coverage. Here's one from December of 1960. And in 1961, we find her here in her laboratory with her mice. She is using radiation to suppress the immune system of mice, and she is giving them lung cancer in 7 days. She thinks she might be onto something important. At that point in time, March 1961, the American Cancer Society has its annual press briefing for the American press in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is 22 miles from Judy's house, and having more guts than judgment, Judy decides to crash the party. She gets there, and right before they throw her out, this man rescues her and starts talking to her, and he is doing his own experiments on cigarettes and lung cancer, and he is Harold Deal, who's the Senior VP of Research for the American Cancer Society and the former Dean of the University of Minnesota Medical School. Judy tells him she's doing cancer in 7 days, and Deal says, well, like 7 days, nobody does that. I mean, that's unheard of, right? Like NCI, people like that, no. And Judy says, well, here, I got my notes, and she shows Deal her notes. And Deal says, this is very interesting. And Deal calls his friend, Dr. Alton Oshner Sr., who's former president of the American Cancer Society and is chief of surgery at Tulane Medical School and is the founder of the multi-$100 million a year Ochsner Clinic in New Orleans, and Ochsner tells Dio, hey, introduce her to George Moore. He's at this meeting. And George Moore is the director of the Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo, New York. He's the first person to use radioactive isotopes to detect cancer in medicine. And he runs a summer program. Did somebody kick something?
No, I think that's electricity on
I
a
still
broader
have
level.
power here.
Well, why don't you click reset on the thing there?
It's probably the orange
Power
cables.
cord?
Could have been one of his cables.
I still have power to the camera.
There's a reset button.
Camera have a battery backup?
Okay, George Moore runs a student program for the National Science Foundation at his cancer research facility. And
Is that up again? It's gone.
we've got traction. All right.
The glasses is on the projector light.
Thank you. Just in the event I need a sip it. All right, these three guys, Deal, Ochsner, and Moore, are the big three in cancer research in the United States. They are the people who prove that tobacco causes cancer, and they are the people who convinced the United States government to put warning labels on cigarettes. These are the people that are now involved with Judith. Deal invites Ochsner to come to the press conference to meet Judy in person, and on March 22nd, 1962, Ochsner flies to St. Petersburg for the last day of the conference to question Judy about her cancer experiments. When the conference ends, Deal, Ochsner, and a third man get in an automobile with Judy and drive to her high school to inspect her laboratory. The third man is named Yuri. Ochsner is very impressed with the primitive conditions that Judy's able to work in, but Yuri says Judy's playing with fire and orders her lab shut down for safety reasons. Okay? I mean, she's got mice and radiation and viruses, and this is level 4 kind of work, and she's doing it in a high school with a wood floor and 2,000 kids to take it home, okay? So Yuri says, no, this thing's getting shut down, okay? So who is this guy, Yuri, who thinks he's got the power to shut down Judy's lab? Well, Judy knew, at the time she wrote a manuscript, well, he's some scientist from the University of Chicago. He knew a lot about radiation, and he thought my lab was dangerous. End of subject. Okay, so I look up Yuri, and I figure out that Yuri is at the Columbia University during World War II, and he runs the war science program, and he was in charge of the Manhattan Project. Okay, now this is more about Ochsner than it is about Judy. This is the kind of guy that is at Alton Ochsner's elbow in 1961. All right? Think of what that means in terms of who Alton Ochsner is. Okay, and these press things prove that Judy was at this meeting, all right? So nobody's making any of this up. Summer 1961, Judy goes up to that National Science Foundation program in Buffalo, New York. Here's her photo, there's her name. She's trained to handle cancer-causing monkey viruses, all right? She learns about the SV40, that's one of the cancer-causing monkey viruses, contamination of the polio vaccine that the public does not know about, but all these doctors know about. And while the other students, they go to their classroom activities during the day and then they go play volleyball and watch TV, Judy goes into Moore's lab and she's getting trained to work on his melanoma project that he's doing with Alton Ochsner in the background. And all this stuff is secret because they don't want to talk about polio vaccine contamination in public. And now they have a teenage girl who can run a laboratory firm that nobody will even suspect. She's a tool. a perfect tool where they can continue research and nobody would even believe they'd have somebody capable of doing it. So for the next 2 years, these three guys, Diehl, Ochsner, and Moore, support Judy's education in exchange for her research on the effects of SV40 and radiation on melanoma. What they're trying to figure out, this is a very big idea, if you've got SV40 in the polio vaccine and you just gave it to 200 million people, I'd like to know if you give them an x-ray to find out if they have lung cancer, whether we're going to activate the cancer-causing virus and give them skin cancer. And I don't want to tell the world I'm asking this question, okay? So Judy is doing this research for them, and here is a abstract published in 1962. There's the date, there's her name, there's the melanoma, there's the human host, and that was published in that place. And we find her in 62, 63 at the University of Florida. The details are in the book, but she's still doing these quiet melanoma research for Ochsner, and she is sending monthly reports to Dr. Ochsner on what she's doing with radiation, with human cancer cells. Then, in the background, the Cuban Missile Crisis happens, and Castro gets the blame. And 6 months later, in April '63, Ochsner calls Judy at the University of Florida and invites her to New Orleans for a summer project, to work on an important project. And in return, Judy will get to skip the last 2 years of college. She will enter Tulane Medical School in the fall. Tuition will be paid for. She will have a stipend. And she will be doing cancer research with Dr. Mary Sherman. Who's Dr. Mary Sherman? Well, she's a professor at Tulane Medical School, ran a cancer lab at Ochsner's clinic, expert in the medical uses of radiation from the University of Chicago, and she is the Mary in Dr. Mary's monkey. So Judy accepts Ochsner's offer. Ochsner sends Judy a Greyhound bus ticket. Judy's 19 years old. The skids are greased. Her future is bright and secure. Her dream of becoming a cancer researcher and finding a cure for cancer is now within reach. On April 19th, 1963, she gets on a bus and goes to New Orleans. Where's my... I've been fighting a cold all week, so. In New Orleans, a handsome young man by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald intercepts Judy at the U.S. Post Office and quickly sets up meetings for Judy to meet his dear friend, Dr. David Ferrie. He sets up a meeting for her to meet Dr. Mary Sherman, and he sets up a meeting for Judy to meet with Dr. Alton Ochsner. Now, if you think this meeting is accidental, we can talk about that later, but in my book, Oswald's already involved in this operation by the time Judy arrives in New Orleans. So, Lee helps Judy get a job at the Riley Coffee Company. Helps Judy find an apartment near his. Okay, here's Judy's apartment, there's Lee's apartment, here's the bus they take to the Riley Coffee Company. Here's Mary Sherman's apartment, here's David Ferrie's apartment, here's the bus they take back and forth between those. Here's the linear particle accelerator at the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital, and here's Dr. Alton Ochsner's house. And Jim, while we're on the subject, you see Loyola University right there? Under the uptown. That's the Green Park and Loyola University. I'm sorry, the mouse didn't work, and I would point to it otherwise. Okay, so Dr. David Ferrie tells Judy they want to kill Fidel Castro to prevent World War III. Bottom line is, in New Orleans in 1963, Judy and Lee helped Dr. Alton Ochsner develop a cancerous biological weapon in an effort to kill Fidel Castro, and David Ferrie and Dr. Mary Sherman were both part of that effort. That's hardly a lone nut, and that's hardly a communist. Okay, so who's this guy, Dr. Alton Ochsner Sr., really? I have a chapter on him in my book, Dr. Mary's Monkey, and it's on my website where you can download it for free. And he's got a lot of interesting friends and associates. Here he is with Wild Bill Donovan, okay, founder of the CIA. Here's his patient and good friend Clint Murchison, who helped finance his hospital. Here's his buddy Anastasio Somoza, dictator of Nicaragua. Here's his other buddy Juan Perón, dictator of Argentina. Here's Ed Butler. Ed Butler ran Ochsner's political organization's anti-communist propaganda mill called Inca, and it was Ed Butler who debated our good friend Lee Harvey Oswald on the radio. Now, Butler works for Ochsner, okay? Ochsner signs his paychecks. Oh, I forgot to mention this. J. Edgar Hoover cleared Dr. Alton Ochsner for a, quote, sensitive position for the U.S. government in 1959. He also, worked with the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, the Army on clandestine assignments, as well as with the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital, where he used to get paid from. Okay, Judy and Lee worked at the Riley Coffee Company. Here is Judy's W-2 form proving that fact. Okay, Dr. Ochsner arranged these jobs, and Lee and Judy became friends. A few things about Judy and Lee. They both arrived in New Orleans in late April 1963. They both left New Orleans in September 1963. They both started work at the William B. Riley Company on May 10th, the same day. They both started at Standard Coffee, which is a subsidiary of Riley, and they both transferred 1 week later to the Riley parent company. They both got apartments along Magazine Avenue the same week, and they both rode the bus to and from work together each day. And they both were fired from Riley. Lee on July 19th and Judy on August 9th, which you might remember is the day Lee gets arrested. All of this is the subject of the book Me and Lee, which I've been working on. It'll be out soon. This is Judy's own story, okay? And Judy, and as you can tell by the cover, it's not designed for the JFK research audience, but to a broader audience. And Judy is a witness. She is not a researcher. And though she is very zealous about this and tries to do some research, we basically said, no, this book is a first-person narrative. It needs to be told in chronological order. And this book is about what Judy saw, what she did, what she saw, and what she heard. And we are particularly interested in what Lee Harvey Oswald told her about the approaching JFK assassination, because he was fully aware that it was coming. Okay, a few highlights from me and Lee for the JFK research crowd. One about the Riley Coffee Company, the Clinton incident, and Lee's trip to Mexico City. On the Riley Coffee Company, William B. Riley is one of the biggest anti-communists in the city of New Orleans. He is a member of Dr. Ochsner's Inca, in fact, a founding member and a major financial contributor of that organization. So Riley and Ochsner are like this, like joined at the hip, as the expression is, all right? And from Judy's description of what was going on inside the Riley Coffee Company, where she worked and where she was the secretary for the vice president, there was a covert cell operating inside the Riley Coffee Company, and it was run by William Moynihan, an ex-FBI agent, if you believe there are such things. And Moynihan controlled the background checks for both Lee Oswald and Judy to make sure that they didn't find out about Lee's defection to the Soviet Union, and that nobody found out about Judy's cancer research, because they didn't want anybody to know about these two things. Then Moynihan also controlled the time cards for Judy and Lee, because they were missing a lot from the building, and when they were missing, they were working on the biological weapon over at David Ferrie's apartment, and all this work was done while they were clocked in at Riley's. And you're welcome to ask me about Bill Moynihan during the Q&A. The Clinton incident that everybody's familiar with here, the purpose of the incident was to test the biological weapon on a human subject at a mental hospital in Jackson, Louisiana. There were 2 trips and 2 cars and different people involved. On August 29th, trip 1 The purpose was to inject the cancer into the human. Clay Shaw drove David Ferrie and Lee Oswald to Jackson, Louisiana. They waited in Clinton, nearby Clinton, which was the county seat, for a convoy containing the prisoners that they were going to inject coming from Angola prison, and it was late. So they wound up getting stuck in Clinton, Louisiana for several hours while CORE was having a voter registration drive. And the reason that CORE was doing that day was it was the day after Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So the people with the black voter registration drive were following up on Martin Luther King. That's how we pinned the date down. 2 days later, August 31st, trip 2, Lee drives Judy to Jackson, Louisiana. Why? Because they have to take blood tests to find out if the cancer weapon has seeded in the human patient. And Judy is an expert at these blood tests, okay? Judy was seen with Lee in Jackson by 2 witnesses. One was the barber and the other was Reeves Morgan's daughter. And the Garrison trial ends, interestingly enough, with James Alcock's concluding arguments, and where he says, we know there was a woman sitting in the car with Lee Oswald, and we know it was not Marina, and we don't know who it was. Well, it was Judy. The Mexico City trip. Well, the purpose was to deliver the biological weapon for transport into Cuba, ostensibly to kill Fidel Castro. Lee waits for the prisoner to die before leaving New Orleans, which is why he's sitting around on his porch reading books all of September instead of handing out communist literature like he was doing in August. Okay? Judy's gone back to Florida at this point because she had a fight with Oshner and he sent her home. But she stays in contact with both David Ferrie and Lee Oswald. Marina leaves on September 23rd. Lee leaves on September 25th. Now, the Warren Commission tells us one thing, and Lee tells Judy something else. Warren Commission says, well, Lee gets on a bus in New Orleans, goes to Houston, goes to Laredo, winds up in Mexico City the next day. There's a problem with the Warren Commission story. That though everyone sees Lee on the bus from Houston to Mexico City, nobody sees him on the bus from New Orleans to Houston. Meanwhile, witnesses, 2 of them, see Lee in Austin, Texas that day, and another witness sees Lee in Dallas that day. So Lee tells Judy, oh yeah, I went to the bus station, put my luggage on the bus went to Houston. Then I climbed in the car with Hugh Ward, that's Guy Bannister's business partner and professional pilot, and Hugh drove me down to Houma, Louisiana, where there was a twin-engine plane waiting on the tarmac. It was a Dove, built by the British firm de Havilland, owned by Schlumberger Tool Company. They're the Halliburton's big brother, if you will. Okay? And Hugh Ward flies Lee and the bioweapon, because Lee's transporting the bioweapon at this point, to Austin, Texas, where he picks up an envelope of money from the governor's office. Then they fly him up to Dallas, where he meets with Jack Ruby and then goes and sees Sylvia Odio. Then they fly him down to Houston, where he gets back on the bus and continues down to Mexico City. So, where can JFK researchers learn more about what Lee told Judy? And he told her a whole bunch of stuff, and I only got 20 minutes and I can't go through all of it here, but there's plenty of it, particularly in the run-up to the assassination. They're speaking weekly, and he's telling her about the plot and what he's trying to do and how he's trapped in it and stuff like that. It's a very interesting narrative running up to the assassination. And that's in the book, Me and Lee. And we also have a website, which is judithverybaker.com. And that includes information, full documents, so you can read the whole text of these things, which we can't reasonably do in a book. There's also videos and music and other things in there that is not possible to put into a book. There's also my website, which is Dr. Mary's Monkey, and you can see I've got a whole bunch of stuff there, but when you go to Dr. Mary's Monkey, remember to spell out doctor. That way you come to my website, not my publisher's. And you get, there are interviews with me there by Jim Mars and other people, interviews with Judith Very Baker by Nigel Turner, interviews with David Lewis's wife by Deborah Conway. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Videos on Jim Garrison compiled by Gil Jesus, And for the researchers who really like to read the footnotes and they're too small to read in Dr. Mary's Monkey, I have the PDF of every footnote organized by chapters that you can go in and blow up to 200% and actually read them. So you can have the footnotes on the screen and while you're reading and stuff. So that's, excuse me. That's Judy's story, and I really think you haven't heard Judy's story until you read this book. And a lot of people have heard bits and pieces, and her reputation's gotten torn apart by McAdams and all these other people on the internet. But this book is really the definitive work on what really happened to her and what she had to say. I wrote the foreword to it. In the back, there's an analysis by Jim Mars. And Jim and I both think that this is a real piece of the puzzle that needs to be analyzed by people like the people in this room who have the knowledge and depth to analyze it properly. And we hope that you will read it with an open mind. And it'll be released early next year. We're not going to rush it. It's too important. We want to finish it up right. And we've got 5 people working on it right now. Trine Day does. We're short on time, so we're going to do 2 questions. We'll start with you.
Yeah, you said that Lee had foreknowledge of the assassination of Kennedy and that he shared with Ferrie. Do you know when, what time of year that was? How early he knew?
Lee first told Judy that...
Here you go.
Sorry. Lee first told Judy that he was being set up as the patsy for the assassination of President Kennedy on July 29th, right after he returned from the Jesuit conference at Spring Hill. Yes?
I'd just like to make a comment. This man is terrific. I've corresponded with Judith since before the love affair was put on television, so I've known her now for 8 years. I deal with her almost daily. She's a tragic figure who has sacrificed her family, her country. There appears to have been attempts to kill her. She's living overseas. She's virtually poverty-stricken. People have helped her, but only minimally financially. Her dog of 13 years just died. If you're going to buy a book because you're interested in this subject, you're not only buying a book and learning more, but you're helping a woman get back on her feet. I urge all of you to purchase this book. Thank you.
Which you can do, thanks Ed, which you can do from her website, judyberrybaker.com. One more?
This is kind of a conundrum question. If Lee Harvey Oswald is not like the socialist, communist, Marxist agent, which most people here don't believe he was, if he was hanging around with these hardcore anti-communist, almost Kennedy haters like, say, David Ferrie and, say, Guy Bannister, why wasn't he like actively involved in the plot himself, meaning him wanting to kill Kennedy rather than just being some sort of a patsy who's trying to stop a plot at the last minute?
He was there on assignment. He was working for the American government.
We're out of time, I'm sorry, but I got to go to the next